This is Eric Schultz, developer advocate at OuterCurve Foundation, with part 3 of my series on creating a visitor pattern toolkit using OuterCurve NuPattern. I strongly recommend that you watch part 1 and part 2 if you haven't already. Also, check out the blog entry that corresponds to this tutorial and gives you the instructions for installing NuPattern and getting the GitHub repository of my visitor pattern code. As we get started, I want to mention how you would create a new element as part of your pattern. Let's say you wanted to add a new collection to be a child of project. To do this, go to the Toolbox and drag Collection over the heading of the project and drop the collection. This new collection is a child of project. We'll delete that now since we don't actually want it. So the next important thing to understand is what variable properties, launch points, and automation mean inside these elements. Variable properties are pretty much what they sound like. They're just pieces of information that is logically connected to an element. It can be something you enter manually or that is provided via code. For example, let's look at the namespace property in project. This is the base namespace of your project. In the Properties pane, look at the Value Provider element. NuPattern library value providers.root namespace value provider is a built-in provider that gets the root namespace from a project. In this case, the project that corresponds to this element. We can change it by opening the dropdown and selecting a value provider. As you can see, they're categorized and have friendly names. Let's look at the class element. In the case of the class element, we have a namespace value property, but our value provider is actually one we created, called namespace from parent. When you create new value providers in the toolkit, they'll populate this list after a build. Let's look at our actual namespace from parent implementation. We go over to the solution builder, and under visitor pattern, automation, library, value providers, we'll double click on namespace from parent. NuPattern uses Managed Extensibility Framework extensively, so a solid understanding of MEF is helpful. You'll see in our code we have a display name, category, and description, which are used in the value provider list we had before. The current element is imported and required. The current element is the element our code is running on. In the case of the class element, it's an instance of the class element, which represents one node class in our project. You could write your provider generalized so it could work on any element, but it's not a requirement. One important restriction to note about NuPattern and MEF is that right now you need to always include the allow default equals true for any MEF imports. This is really easy to forget, so make sure that allow default equals true is there. The meat of the code is in the evaluate method, which in this case is pretty straightforward. I'll let you work through it on your own time. So let's go back and talk about launch points and automation when it comes to our pattern model elements. Launch points are places where you can tell NuPattern that you want to receive a callback on a given NuPattern event. You can create your own events, but NuPattern has a number built in, including some that wrap events already in Visual Studio. We won't discuss how to create events in this tutorial, but I did build one called Project Change that you can look at in Solution Builder. A launch point captures an event and then runs a command or wizard. Let's look at how the Generate Visitor on Build launch point is configured. If you click on Generate Visitor on Build and go to the Property pane, expand settings, you'll see that the command is set to generate visitor. And the triggering event is when a build is being started. You also notice the conditions collection too. Your launch point can have a set of conditions so that it only runs its command or wizard when all those conditions are true. Let's look at the generate visitor automation on project that this launch point is using. This particular instance of the command is one that takes in one of the text templates in our solution builder, in this case the visitor interface template, and runs it on our project. Selecting the text template is easy, even though it's a funny URL. Just click on the Show Details button, and you can see all the text templates available in your project. Let's look at that corresponding text template right now. We'll go over here and double click on the visitor interface. Text templates are pretty simple to use because, as you can see, they have access to the element's object, so you can run code to create your template. The Create New Class template is run the exact same way from the class element. I encourage you to explore the commands on the other elements, including the ones I created. We've gone through the basic concepts of creating a NuPattern toolkit. It's important to know, though, how to build, debug, and deploy your toolkit. It's actually pretty simple. Just build your solution. This installs the toolkit into the experimental instance of Visual Studio. You can either run the experimental instance yourself, or you can just press debug, which will launch the experimental instance of Visual Studio with the debugger attached. Deploying your toolkit is pretty easy as well. Your toolkit is available in the solution directory in the binaries subdirectory. I hope this series gave you insight into what types of problems NuPattern solves and how NuPattern toolkits are structured. If you're interested in learning more, make sure to visit NuPattern's website and the other links in the description below.